thank you, Dana, for that introduction. And it's a real pleasure to be talking to such a great group of urban forestry professionals. I'm guessing that most, if not all of you, are familiar with this diagram from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment and the ways that this concept of ecosystem services has played an important role in promoting investment in urban green infrastructure. And in particular, the concept I've got circled here of regulating ecosystem services, such as the role that the urban tree canopy plays in reducing the urban heat island effect and in reducing the costs of stormwater management. What has been largely absent from these conversations, with the exception of community gardens and urban farms, is a discussion of provisioning and cultural ecosystem services that are provided by urban green infrastructure. And I'd like to have such a conversation with you today, kicking it off by telling you a story. So the two ladies that you see here are Nepali Bhutanese refugees who have resettled in Syracuse, New York. And in the first year that this community was in Syracuse, a local non-governmental organization worked with the city to provide land for the community to garden in, and gardeners were given seeds for common produce from U.S. gardens, and they planted those seeds and they carefully tended the plants. And late in the season, these ladies went to their garden one morning with the intention of harvesting cucumbers and tomatoes for the family meal. But they found that their cucumbers and tomatoes had all been stolen in the night. However, not all was lost, because beginning several weeks before any possibility of harvesting the cultivated produce, these ladies had been foraging for lamb's quarters around the perimeters of the garden plots and in an adjacent vacant lot. They've been able to forage pounds and pounds of lamb's quarters on an ongoing basis. Now, lamb's quarters in Nepali Bhutanese are called betu, and betu might be considered a cultural keystone food for this community. So what I'd like to talk to you about in somewhat greater depth here this afternoon are the results from two studies that dive deeper into the provisioning and cultural ecosystem services provided by foraging in urban environments. These two studies are part of an ongoing program of multi-city research taking place in Baltimore, Chicago, New York City, Philadelphia, and research that we've completed in Seattle. It's also undertaken under the umbrella of the Resilience, Health, and Well-Being emphasis of the New York City Urban Field Station, which is a collaborative endeavor of the U.S. Forest Service Research and Development Arm and the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation. And we began these two studies in 2000. Well, the background, actually, for these two studies was work that we began in 2011 interviewing New York City Parks Department personnel, from the then Commissioner Adrian Benepe down to the manager of a small subsection of a neighborhood park and a number of levels of personnel in between there, about three things. First, what were their observations of foraging in parks in the city? Second, what concerns do they have about that foraging? And third, what opportunities, if any, do they see emerging from foraging in the parks? And in response to that first question, what we heard across the board to a person from everyone we spoke with was that they have observed something on the order of what you see here in this orange circle. That is, for people they perceive as Asian immigrants foraging for things like what is likely happening here, dandelions in the early spring. And what we found as people were talking to us about these observations was a great deal of curiosity about what is it that's exactly going on here, and a great deal of compassion about the imagined significance of these foraging activities for these folks. We decided that then there was definitely a research need there, and we decided also to particularly concentrate our efforts on understanding foraging by immigrant communities in New York City. And we began those studies by looking at foraging by two of the most rapidly growing immigrant communities in New York, the Chinese community and the Mexican community. We conducted that research using community researchers who are culturally and linguistically fluent, and we recruited folks through community centers so that as we interviewed people, they would be comfortable and would be able to speak in the language of their choice. So the first community that we worked with closely was the Chinese and Chinese American community in New York City. We interviewed approximately 30 individuals. About 75% of them were over 60 years old, about 25% of them under 30 years of age. One individual in that sample is a first-generation Chinese-American university professor who foraged for the New York Times City Desk with a column called 12 Months of Foraging in New York City. And she told us about 44 species of plants and mushrooms that she forages in the city. However, she is clearly an exception, and so setting aside her species list, if we look at the composite species list of the rest of the folks in our sample, they reported foraging 39 plant materials and mushrooms. And you see here a list of those species that were mentioned by 8 or more individuals. I'd like to call your attention to what I'm calling the status of these species, and you can see that all of them are horticultural and or weedy species. And also to the uses that are made of those species. All are food and or medicine. And particularly in the Chinese community, that food-medicine binary is often a distinction without a difference. And it's perhaps more meaningful to think in terms of functional foods, foods that are understood to play an important role in maintaining the health of an individual. Moving along to the species that were foraged by Mexican immigrants with whom we spoke, we interviewed 20 women, all of whom were born and spent their childhoods in the Central Highlands of Mexico. And as a group, they report foraging 30 species or complexes of species, of vascular species, and 2 mushroom species. And again here, you have a list of those that were mentioned by 8 or more people. Again, all are horticultural and or weedy species. And again, all of these are used for food or medicine, with definitely functional foods being a consideration here as well. Now, it's interesting to look at what some of the differences might be between cultural groups and their practices. And that definitely shows up when we look a little deeper into the species list, when we compare what is common to the lists and what is different on these 2 lists. So let's go backward then to look at that first list of species. And you see that there are dandelion greens and purslane on this list. Similarly, there is dandelion and purslane on the list of species reported to be foraged by the folks in the Mexican foraging study. But otherwise, this is a very divergent set of species that are being foraged. At the same time, there is a great deal of commonality between the two groups of foragers. In terms of the places that they are foraging, commonly visited locations include parks, residences, institutional campuses such as universities and hospitals, public rights-of-way, and vacant lots. And let's just turn our attention to this photograph here for a moment to think about how it might be a foraging space. What first jumps out are these mulberry trees that are right here. And you may be able to see that they're very close to this chain link fence. We're told by Parks Department personnel that they're not terribly fond of these mulberry trees. They didn't plant them, and in fact, they're there probably because birds perched on the fence, deposited seeds, and lawnmowers couldn't get close enough to eliminate them before they became full-blown trees. So here, most folks are foraging for the berries on those mulberry trees, but a couple of folks in the Chinese-American study reported that they also use newly emerged leaves as a medicinal tea. Looking down low along that fence, we see a number of high-ish plants. That's a perfect place to be foraging for mugwort, for lamb's quarters, similar species. While here in the tree pits, you could expect to find things like plantain and dandelion greens. There are also some avoidance practices in terms of places that folks report. They're definitely looking out for where they think herbicides and pesticides might be sprayed and trying to avoid those, and also trying to avoid dog waste. And so a park such as that shown here would be a particularly good place for avoiding dog waste. You see that it has a playground back here. It's fenced in, and dogs are prohibited from entering this area. We really wanted to understand, what does this mean for the people who engage in it? And we've got some very rich information about that. For some people, the food that is obtained through foraging is, at least from time to time, very important. And in terms of what we know about urban food deserts, we can definitely surmise that such food is important in terms of addressing potential micronutrient malnutrition due to the lack of availability of fresh produce in many areas, particularly low-income areas of cities. But more often, and perhaps more eloquently, we heard from the folks we spoke with about the importance of foraging for them in terms of maintaining their identity, of maintaining customs from their place of origin, and of being able to teach those customs to their children and their grandchildren, and of being able to experience on a daily basis and on a festival and holiday basis the foods and flavors that really mark their identity. We also heard expressions of what the growing body of research that is showing the importance of being active in nature and out in nature has for maintaining both physical and emotional health and well-being. At the same time, all is not rosy in the urban foraging landscape, and we've definitely heard a number of anxieties from people. One is a concern about the potential for exposure to contamination, and this flies in the face of a conviction that the fresh food and medicine that one can obtain by foraging is fundamentally healthy. So a lot of worries about whether or not, well, not I would say a lot of worries, but definitely worries and efforts to avoid the risk of exposure to contamination that would counterbalance that perception of health. There's also a sense that there are probably rules about this, But most of the folks we spoke with really don't know what those rules might be. They generally don't speak English, and the rules are not all that terribly readily available in general, especially if you don't speak English. And so folks are concerned about the possibility of getting in trouble and, for example, having a fine or just being scolded. So let's circle back then to this concept of ecosystem services and their contributions to human well-being, and look at what urban foraging has to tell us about how urban nature provides provisioning and cultural ecosystem services. Perhaps the first and most obvious lesson here is that provisioning is cultural. So provisioning and cultural ecosystem services are presented here as two separate boxes, largely for analytical convenience. But really, it would perhaps be more appropriate to represent this as a Venn diagram with two circles, one provisioning, one cultural, and a really large overlap between those two circles as pertains to urban foraging. And in terms of how those provisioning and cultural activities contribute to human well-being, we see that they're a part of security for individuals who engage in these practices. And that is both in the idiosyncratic or individual security that perhaps occurs when someone, for example, loses a job, or we've heard about people whose income wouldn't make it to the end of the week, and foraging helped to provide food when the cupboards were beginning to get awfully bare. But also covariate or group crisis, such as individuals who are fleeing armed conflict or who are experiencing the double dislocation of moving from their homeland to a new land and from a rural environment to an urban environment. Foraging provides materials that are considered to really enhance the quality of life for people, and particularly because these are foods and health supports that are culturally appropriate and that reinforce cultural traditions and cultural notions of what health is and how one maintains health. And it does so through use values, that is, people are consuming directly, personally themselves and among their families and occasionally among friends the materials that they are foraging themselves. This contributes to both physical and emotional health and well-being. And it supports identity and a sense of security. In particular, this is in a multi-generational fashion, so that the young folks in our Chinese American foraging study all learned initially to forage from their grandparents and ceased to do so when they were teenagers, but have come back to foraging both as a way of remembering their grandparents and what their grandparents taught them, and as a way of connecting with the environment. So what does this have to say about urban green infrastructure planning and management? Well, we're still in conversation with New York City Parks personnel about whether or not there might be a possibility for foragers to be allies rather than outlaws. But it would be an unwise swing of the pendulum to go from the present status, which is largely that these practices are forbidden, to it being just a free-for-all. We think that there is the opportunity for some discussion to begin on what sustainable and equitable governance might look like. And those conversations will need to cover a lot of territory, including what species it might be okay to forage and what not, what places it might be all right to forage and what not. We also think that there are opportunities for urban green infrastructure to provide food and medicine by design, and Lincoln's going to talk about that at length now. But doing so challenges us to adopt a new standard of what constitutes healthy urban green infrastructure, and that is urban nature that's healthy enough to eat from. Thank you very much.